The grey blazer had a thread coming loose at the left cuff, and on the morning of the 9th interview, Renee pressed it flat with her thumb, the way a mother smooths a child's collar before church. It was the same blazer she had worn 8 times before into 8 lobbies with 8 different logos on the wall, and 8 times she had walked back out to the bus stop with the same answer waiting for her in an email she would not open until she got home. She did not know that this morning, behind a glass wall on the 4th floor of a building she had not yet entered, a man was about to look down at a printed schedule, read a name he had not seen in 11 years, and feel the floor tilt under him. She did not know that. She only knew the blazer needed pressing. There was a small iron she kept on a folding board in the corner of the 1-bedroom apartment she shared with her son, and she ran it over the lapels twice. Then over the cuff, where the thread had come loose, careful not to scorch the fabric because she could not afford to replace it. The blazer had cost her $11 at a church resale 2 years back, and it had been worth every cent, and it had also become a kind of quiet humiliation she carried into every room because she knew what hiring managers saw when a woman walked in wearing the same grey jacket she had worn the last time, if any of them remembered. And she had stopped letting herself believe. Any of them remembered. Her name was Renee Caldwell, and she was 36 years old, and she had been out of steady work for 14 months. It had not always been this way. There had been a time when she wore a badge that opened doors, when her own desk sat behind a glass wall on a high floor, when the loose thread on a cuff would have been a thing she handed to a tailor without thinking about the cost. That time felt like a story that had happened to a different woman. She kept a photograph from it in a drawer and did not look at it often, because looking at it did not help. And Renee had learned in 14 months to set down anything that did not help. What helped was the routine, up at 5:30, coffee, the cheap kind, no sugar, because sugar had become a small luxury she rationed for her son's cereal, iron the blazer, lay out the white blouse washed by hand the night before and dried over the shower rod so it would not cost $1.50 at the laundromat, polish the black flats with a damp cloth, pin her locks back into a low, neat bun. She did this the same way every time, with the same care, because the care was the one thing the 14 months had not taken from her, and she would not let them take it. There was a precision to it that an outside eye might have called excessive for a woman heading to her 9th rejection, but the precision was the point. The world had taken her title and her salary and her two-broom with the garden daycare, and it had taken, slowly, the part of her that woke up sure of anything. What it had not taken was the fold of a cuff, the angle of a collar, the shine on a worn shoe, and so she gave those things everything she had, the way a person clings to the one room in a flooding house that is still dry. She had read somewhere once that you cannot always control whether a door opens, only whether you are ready when it does, and she had decided 14 months ago that she would be ready every single time, even the times the door stayed shut, because readiness was a kind of dignity, and dignity was the last thing she owned outright. Her son was 9, his name was Marcus, and he slept in the bedroom while she took the fold-out couch, and that arrangement was not up for discussion, no matter how many times he offered to switch. He had her steadiness and his father's easy laugh, and his father was not in the picture and had not been since Marcus was 4, and Renee did not waste breath on that subject either. She had one job now, the way she saw it, and the job was Marcus. Everything else, the interviews, the blazer, the bus, the careful arithmetic of a checking account that hovered near nothing, all of it was in service of the boy asleep behind the door. That morning he woke before she left, which he usually did not, and he padded out in his socks and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her check her reflection in the dark window. "Is it the grey one again?" he said, not unkind. Just 9 and observant. "It's the grey one again." He came over and looked at the cuff where she had pressed the thread flat. "It looks nice, Mom." She put her hand on the back of his head and held it there a second. "Eat your cereal, Mrs. Blatt. Okafor's taking you to school." "You're going to get this one," he said, with the total confidence of a child who has not yet learned how often the world says no. "I can tell." She did not tell him that she had felt that same certainty on the morning of the 3rd interview and the 5th, and that certainty was a thing she had also learned to set down. She looked at him a moment instead, this boy who got himself up for school without being asked, who had stopped requesting the things he saw other kids have because he had worked out on his own. That asking cost her something, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was a better person at 9 than most people managed in a lifetime, and that whatever she was out here in the cold every morning trying to win, it was for him. She kissed the top of his head and told him she loved him and went out into the cold to catch the 6:15. The bus was nearly empty at that hour. Just a few night shift workers heading home and a woman about Renee's age in scrubs who nodded at her the way working people nod at each other, acknowledgement without words. Renee took a window seat and held her folder of resumes flat on her lap so it would not crease, and she watched the city slide by grey and waking, the shuttered storefronts, the steam rising off a vent, a man unlocking the gate of a corner market, and she ran through her answers in her head one more time. Tell me about a time you solved a difficult problem. Tell me about a gap in your employment history. She had answers for all of it. She had learned to talk about the 14 months without flinching, to frame them as a season of caretaking and recalibration, which was the truth, wrapped in language that would not frighten a hiring manager. The woman in scrubs got off 3 stops in, and a man got on with a paint-spattered jacket and a thermos, and sat near the front and did not look at anyone. And Renee watched him and thought about how a city at 6 in the morning was made entirely of people going to hold something together for someone else. She had been one of those people her whole working life. She had a memory of her own mother in a different city in a different decade, riding a different early bus to a hospital where she emptied bins and mopped floors and never once let her children see her tired. And Renee understood that she came from a long line of women who pressed their collars flat and went out into the cold, and that there was no shame in the line, only weight, and the weight was the inheritance. She straightened the folder on her lap. She checked the cuff. The thread was still flat. None of her rehearsed answers had worked yet, not once in 8 tries. And she told herself the 9th time might be different and did not believe it and went anyway, because going was the job. The 14 months had a beginning, and the beginning was a company called Halloran Freight, where Renee had worked for 6 years and risen from a coordinator to a manager of operations, with 11 people reporting to her and a salary that had let her sign a lease on a 2-bedroom and put Marcus in a daycare with a garden. She had been good at it. She had been the person who stayed late to fix what others broke, who knew every driver's name and every driver's kids' names, who caught the accounting error that would have cost the company $90,000 and never once asked for credit. She remembered the morning they told her. It had been a Friday, and the new ownership had brought in a man from the merging company who wore a watch worth more than her car and could not meet her eyes, and he had read from a single page in a conference room while 11 people she had hired and trained and gone to bat for sat in a row of chairs and understood, one by one, what was happening to them. He had used the word transition. He had used the word streamline. He had thanked them for their service in the voice of a man reading a grocery list. And Renee, who had run that floor for 2 years without a single account lost, had stood up at the end and gathered her things and walked each of her 11 people out herself, one at a time, with a steady hand on her shoulder and a word for each, because that was the last thing she could do for them, and she was not going to fail to do it, just because the floor had fallen out from under her too. The severance had lasted exactly as long as it took her to learn how thin the job market had become for a 35-year-old black woman with a resume that ended at a company that no longer existed. She had not been bitter about it. Bitterness was another thing that did not help. She had been afraid instead, quietly and constantly for 14 months, and the fear had a face, and the face was Marcus's, and that was why she pressed the blazer flat every time and went back out into the cold. The building for the 9th interview was downtown, a tower of pale stone and dark glass that she had to crane her neck to see the top of, and the name on the wall was Whitfield Logistics, and the posting had been for an operations coordinator, a step down from what she had once been, but a step up from nothing. And she had wanted it the way you want a door when you have been standing in the cold a long time. She gave her name to the security desk, and they printed her a paper badge and pointed her to the elevators, and she rode up to the 4th floor with her folder flat against her chest and her heart going hard. The waiting area on the fourth floor had good chairs and bad coffee and a window that looked out over the grey morning, and there were two other candidates already seated. A young man in a sharp navy suit who could not have been more than 25, and a woman in a tailored dress that Renee recognized as expensive because she had once owned dresses like it. Renee sat down in her $11 blazer and her hand-wash blouse and her polished flats, and she felt, the way she had felt 8 times before, the particular smallness of being the most prepared person in the room and looking like the least. The young man had his phone out and his leg bouncing, and he glanced at Renee once and then back at his screen with a quick dismissal of someone who has already decided where a person belongs in a room. The woman in the tailored dress was reviewing notes on a leather folio and did not look at anyone. Renee had learned to read these rooms in 8 tries. She knew the small economies of how people sized each other up, the flick of an eye toward a shoe, the quiet ranking that happened before anyone said a word, and she knew where she landed in it, the woman in the same grey jacket, the woman who had taken the early bus. She had stopped letting it bend her posture. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded over her folder, and she waited, and she prayed a little. The short kind of prayer that is more like a steadying breath with a name attached, and the name was always Marcus. She watched the young man get called in first, and he came out 20 minutes later, loose-shouldered and smiling. And then the woman in the tailored dress went in, and Renee waited, and she ran her thumb once more over the loose thread at her cuff, flattening it, the small private ritual that had become the whole shape of her hope. What she did not know was that on the floor above her, in an office with his name on the door, a man named David Whitfield was looking at the morning's interview schedule and had stopped on the 3rd name down. He read it twice. Renee Caldwell. He set down his coffee. David was 54 years old, and he had built the company from a single warehouse into one with offices in 4 cities. And he was not a man who startled easily, and he was startled now. He sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the same grey morning Renee had ridden in through, and 11 years fell away from him in a single breath. 11 years ago, David Whitfield had not been the man with his name on a building. 11 years ago, he had been a man whose company was failing, whose marriage was failing with it, who had driven a freight route himself because he could not afford to pay a driver, and who had walked into a Halloran freight loading dock at 4 in the morning with a load that was wrong, paperwork that was wronger, and a temper he was ashamed of even then. He had been exhausted and frightened, and one bad week from losing everything, and he had taken it out on the first person who tried to help him, which had been a young coordinator with a clipboard and a calm voice who had stood in front of his fury and not flinched. He remembered her now with a clarity that embarrassed him. He had shouted at her. He had told her she was incompetent, that her whole operation was incompetent, that he would have her job. He had said things a frightened man says when he has run out of every other thing to say. And the young coordinator had waited until he was done, and then she had looked at his paperwork, really looked at it, and she had found the error that was not his and not hers, but the shipper's 300 miles back, and she had spent the next 2 hours on the phone in the cold loading dock fixing a problem that was not hers to fix, for a man who had just screamed in her face because she had told him simply when he tried to apologize. That was the job. He could still see the loading dock if he closed his eyes. The way her breath had fogged in the cold while she held the phone to her ear with one shoulder and worked a clipboard with both hands. She had not raised her voice at him once, not even when she had every right to. And that, more than the saved load, was the thing that had stayed with him. Because David had spent his whole life until that night believing that the way you survive was by being the loudest and the hardest person in the room, and a woman with a clipboard and a calm voice had shown him in 2 hours that he had it exactly backward. When she finally hung up the phone and told him his load was cleared and his contract was safe, he had stood there in the cold trying to find words big enough and had managed only a rough thank you, and she had nodded and gone back inside to the rest of her shift. And he had driven away, changed, and had spent 11 years becoming the man that one cold night had shown him he could be. She had saved his load. The load had saved his contract. The contract had been the thread he pulled to keep the whole thing from unraveling, and within 3 years he had turned the company around, and within 11 he had built the tower of pale stone and dark glass. In all that time he had never forgotten the name on the clipboard. because he had written it on a sticky note that same morning and kept it in his wallet as a reminder of the kind of man he never wanted to be again and the kind of person he hoped to become. He had looked for her in the early years, when he had money enough to think about debts. Halloran Freight had been bought and dissolved by then, and the records had scattered, and the trail had gone cold, and David had let it go cold because life moves, and the urgent crowds out the important, and he had carried the guilt of that, the way men carry small stones in their shoes for years, aware of it only when they step a certain way. And now her name was on his interview schedule, for a coordinator position, 2 pay grades below what she had been when she saved him. He stood up and went to the window and stood there a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called down to the 4th floor and asked the recruiter, in a voice he kept carefully level, whether the candidate named Caldwell had arrived. He had. She was waiting. He said he would conduct that interview himself, and he ignored the surprised pause on the other end of the line, and he hung up and stood there a moment longer, gathering himself, because he understood that he was about to walk into a room and meet a debt he had spent 11 years failing to pay. Down on the 4th floor, Renee did not know any of this. She knew only that the woman in the tailored dress had come out of the interview room looking pleased, and that the recruiter had come to the door and said, with a small frown of confusion, she did not understand that there had been a change and that Renee would be meeting with someone upstairs. She gathered her folder and stood and smoothed the grey blazer down over her hips and pressed the loose thread at her cuff flat one more time, and she followed the recruiter to the elevator and rode up. And the higher the floor numbers climbed, the harder her heart went, because in 14 months no interview had ever moved her upstairs. And she did not know whether that was a good sign or the prelude to a particular kind of no she had not yet received. The office she was shown into was large and quiet and looked out over the whole grey city, and a man stood at the window with his back to her, a tall man in a charcoal suit, broad through the shoulders, and when he turned around Renee saw a face she did not recognize. A black man in his 50s, with close-cut greying hair and a deep furrow between his brows and eyes that were doing something strange, looking at her as though she were a word he had been trying to remember for a long time. "Caldwell," he said. "Please, sit down." She sat. She set her folder on the edge of the desk and folded her hands on top of it, and waited the way she had learned to wait, and she watched the man cross the room and sit down across from her, and not pick up her resume, which she had laid out neatly, and instead simply look at her with that strange searching expression, until it began to make her uneasy. "You don't remember me," he said. It was not a question. Renee looked at him carefully. She was good with faces, had always been good with faces, and she searched his and found nothing, and she said honestly, because honesty was the only currency she had brought into the room, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "We've met," David said. "Once a long time ago. You wouldn't have any reason to remember it the way I do." He paused, and she watched him press his palms flat against the desk the way a man does when he is steadying himself, and he said, 11 years ago, a freight coordinator at a company called Halloran spent 2 hours of her shift fixing a paperwork problem that wasn't hers, in the cold, for a man who had just stood in her loading dock and screamed in her face that she was incompetent. Do you remember that night? And Renee did. It came back to her not as a memory she had been keeping, but as one she had filed and forgotten, a 4 a.m. shift, among hundreds, an angry driver among many, a wrong load and a long phone call, and a man who had tried to apologize at the end, and to whom she had said something she said often in those days because it was simply true. She remembered the cold of the loading dock and the steam of her own breath and the particular exhaustion of fixing what was not hers to fix. And she remembered, yes, an angry man who had gone quiet, who had stood off to the side while she worked the phone, who had thanked her in a voice gone rough at the end. She had not thought about him in years. She had fixed 1,000 problems for 1,000 difficult people. It was the job. She remembered him better the longer she looked. A younger man, leaner then, with the wild exhaustion of someone running on no sleep and pure fear, who had come in swinging because swinging was the only thing he had left. She remembered deciding, somewhere in the first minute of his shouting, that he was not actually a cruel man but a drowning one, and that the load on his truck was probably the only thing standing between him and going under, and she had decided to save the load, not for him, but because saving loads was what she did, and a man's fear did not change the work. She had not expected to remember it. She had certainly not expected the man to remember her. And now, here he sat, grey at the temples and steady, in a way the younger man had not been, telling her that the 2 cold hours she had given a stranger 11 years ago had been the hinge his whole life turned on. "That was you," she said slowly. "That was me, David. And I have spent 11 years not being able to find you to say what I should have said that night, which is that you saved my company, and you did it for a man who didn't deserve 1 minute of your help, and you did it without ever asking for a thing." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "I kept your name in my wallet. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you because it's the truth, and you should hear it from me. You have been on a piece of paper in my pocket for 11 years. And this morning, your name was on my interview schedule, applying for a job 2 levels below the one you were already doing the night you saved me, and I need you to understand that I am having a hard time sitting still right now." Renee did not say anything for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the grey city went about its morning. She had walked into 8 rooms in 14 months and been measured and found, somehow, insufficient, and she had pressed her loose thread flat and gone home and not let it break her. And now she was sitting in the 9th room, and a man she had helped and forgotten was telling her that her name had been in his pocket for 11 years. And the thing rising in her chest was so large and so unfamiliar that she had to breathe carefully around it. "I lost my job 14 months ago," she said finally, because she did not know what else to say, and because the plain facts were the floor she stood on. "The company merged. They let my whole department go. I've been looking ever since. This is the 9th interview I've worn this jacket to." She stopped, surprised at herself, because she had not meant to say that last part, had not meant to let the grey blazer into the room as anything other than what she was wearing. "It was out now, though. I washed the blouse by hand the night before. I didn't want you to think I only own 1 outfit." David looked at the woman across his desk in her carefully pressed $11 blazer with the thread she had smoothed flat at the cuff, and something in his face came apart and reassembled into something quieter. "I think you own exactly the thing that matters," he said, "and I think it's the same thing you owned in that loading dock 11 years ago. I just got rich enough to recognize it." He stood up then, and he did not pick up her resume, and he came around the desk, and Renee stood too, uncertain, and he held out his hand. And when she took it, he held it in both of his, the way you hold something you had given up finding. "I'm not going to interview you for the coordinator job," he said. "I'd be ashamed to. I run an operations division across 4 cities, and the woman who ran it for the last 2 years left in the spring, and I've been doing the job myself, and badly. I want you to come look at it, not as a favor. I don't do favors with a company this size. I can't afford to. I want you to look at it because the night you saved my freight, you also showed me exactly how you handle a crisis that isn't yours, and that is the single most expensive skill in my entire business, and I have spent 11 years unable to buy it because the person who had it walked out of a loading dock and disappeared." Let go of her hand. "The salary is not a coordinator's salary. I'll have the number to you this afternoon. I think it will change some things for you." Renee sat back down because her legs had stopped being reliable. She thought about Marcus, asleep behind the bedroom door that morning, certain, in the way of children, that she would get this one. She thought about the fold-out couch and the cheap coffee and the careful arithmetic of a checking account that hovered near nothing. She thought about 14 months of pressing a loose thread flat and walking back out to the bus stop with the same answer waiting in an email she would not open until she got home. And she found that she was crying quietly the way she did everything, without performance, 2 lines running down and dropping onto the folder she had kept so flat and so careful all morning. "I have a son," she said. "He's 9. He told me this morning I was going to get this one." "He was right," David said. "Smart kid." She laughed, which surprised them both, a wet laugh that broke in the middle, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, careful even now not to smudge, and David handed her a tissue from a box on the credenza and gave her a moment, and the moment was the kind that does not need to be filled with words. Two people on either side of a debt finally being paid 11 years late and exactly on time. What followed took the rest of the day, and then the rest of the week, and it was not a fairy tale, because Renee would not have trusted a fairy tale, and David knew better than to offer her one. He walked her down to the operations floor that afternoon and introduced her to the team she would be inheriting, and the team was a mess, understaffed and demoralized and behind on 3 major accounts, and Renee felt the old familiar thing wake up in her, the part of her that saw a broken system and itched to fix it. She asked sharp questions. She found in 20 minutes 2 problems the team had been working around for months. The first was a young dispatcher named Tasha, who had been covering 2 desks since the spring and had stopped flagging late loads because no one ever did anything when she flagged them. And Renee watched her brace for a reprimand and instead asked her quietly how long she had been carrying 2 jobs on 1 salary, and watched the girl's face change when she realized the new manager was angry on her behalf and not at her. The second was a routing system that someone 3 managers ago had set up to save $1 a load, and that was quietly costing the company a fortune in deadhead miles. And Renee saw it the way she saw everything all at once, the small wrong thing at the center of the big slow bleed. She did not announce either discovery. She wrote them in the margin of a legal pad in her small, even hand, and kept walking the floor and shaking the hands of people who had been working in the dark so long they had forgotten anyone was supposed to come turn the lights on. David stood at the back of the room and watched her do it, and felt the last of his 11-year stonework loose from his shoe. The number came that afternoon in an email Renee opened the moment it arrived, which was a first, because for 14 months she had not opened a single one until she got home. It was more than she had made at Halloran. It was more than she had let herself imagine. She read it twice, and then she read it a third time, and then she sat down on a bench in the lobby of the tower of pale stone, dark glass, and she put her hand over her mouth, and she let herself feel it, the whole size of it, the door finally open after 14 months in the cold. She did the arithmetic she had done every night for 14 months, except this time the arithmetic ran the other way. The rent covered, with room left over, the cheap coffee, a choice now and not a sentence. The daycare with a garden she had pulled Marcus out of, suddenly back within reach, and a second bedroom, and a winter coat for the boy that fit him, instead of one bought a size too big to last 2 seasons. She sat on the bench and watched people cross the marble lobby in their good shoes, the same lobby she had walked into that morning feeling like the least person in it, and she understood that nothing about her had changed between that morning and this afternoon, except that one room had finally seen what had been true the whole time. And she thought about how strange it was that a life could turn on being recognized, on a single man with a long memory looking at a schedule and reading a name. She called Mrs. Okafor first to ask her to keep Marcus a little longer. Then she did not call anyone else. She took the bus home, the same bus, the 6:15's evening cousin, and she watched the same city slide by, and it looked different now, not because anything in it had changed, but because she had walked out of a room with her dignity not just intact but seen, and that is a thing that changes the look of a street. She started the next Monday. She wore the grey blazer because it was still the nicest thing she owned, and she was not a woman to spend money she did not yet have in hand. And on her second Friday, David stopped by her new desk, which sat behind a glass wall on a high floor, and set a flat box on it without a word, and kept walking. Inside was a tailored charcoal blazer in her exact size, with a card that said only for the loose thread, and Renee understood that he had noticed it that first morning, the thing she had pressed flat 8 times before him and once in front of him, and had said nothing then because was not the moment, and had remembered it the way he remembered everything because he was a man who kept his debts written down. She did not stop wearing the grey one. She hung the new blazer in her office and wore it on the days that mattered, the big account days, the days she needed armour, and she wore the grey one on the ordinary days because the grey one had walked her through 14 months of no, and into the one, yes, that changed everything. And a woman does not throw away the thing that carried her. Within a year, she had turned the operations division around the way David had known she would, pulled the 3 major accounts back from the edge, and landed a 4th, learned the names of every driver and every driver's kids, stayed late to fix what others broke, and never once asked for credit. Because that was the job, and it had always been the job, and the job had finally found a room that knew what it was worth. She gave Tasha the 2nd salary the girl had been owed since spring, and a title to go with it, and she fixed the routing system in her first month and saved the company more in a quarter than her own salary cost in a year, and she did not point that out to anyone because pointing it out had never been the job either. She moved Marcus and herself into a 2-bedroom with a window that got the morning light, and Marcus took the bigger room because she insisted, and she took the smaller one and slept in an actual bed for the first time in 2 years, and on the first morning in the new place she stood at the window with her cheap coffee, which she still drank because some habits are not about money, and she watched the light come up over a city that had once felt like a closed door and now felt like a place she lived. She thought about the 8 emails she had not opened until she got home, the 8 quiet no's she had carried up the stairs and set down without letting Marcus see, and she understood that she had not been wrong to keep going, that the going itself had been the thing, the stubborn, faithful going, and that it had carried her here. On a Saturday that spring, Marcus found the grey blazer hanging in her closet and asked if it was the same one, the interview one, and she said it was. He ran his thumb over the cuff where the thread had been, which she had finally let a tailor fix, and he said he remembered telling her she was going to get that one. "You did tell me that," she said. "I was right," he said, grinning. 9 no longer. 10 now, and insufferable about it. "You were right," she said, and she put her hand on the back of his head the way she had that cold morning, and held it there a second, and felt the whole long road behind them settle into something she could finally call rest. The care a person takes when no one is watching, the loose thread smooth flat for a room that may not even remember her, the 2 hours spent in the cold, fixing a problem that is not hers for a man who does not deserve it. None of it is ever truly wasted. It is written down somewhere. In a wallet, or a memory, or the simple architecture of a just world, and it keeps, it waits. And sometimes on the 9th try, on the morning a person has almost stopped believing, it walks across a room and takes a hand in both of its own and tells her it remembered all along. The following Sunday, Renee took the grey blazer down from the closet to wear to church, and she ran her thumb once over the smooth cuff out of old habit, the way another person might touch a doorframe on the way out of a house they had loved. She put the blazer on, she held her hand out to her son, and the 2 of them went down the stairs and out into the morning light, which was warm now and falling on a street that had finally become a place where they belonged. If you have ever pressed something flat and walked into a room you were sure would tell you no, you already know the size of what Renee felt when that door finally opened. Stay close, I will tell you another one.